Well, as we say in America, today is Thanksgiving. So happy Thanksgiving to all of the viewers from America. Christian, I know you're in Germany. You don't have a Thanksgiving out there, but it's a big
No,
day for Americans today.
it is, yeah. Well, we'll still
But
have dinner tomorrow.
that's right. You have some Americans out there like my daughter, but no, it's good. I think it's kind of appropriate, today being Thanksgiving in America, it's the appointed time here in the USA to gather together for a day of Thanksgiving of the blessings that really God has given the American people. And I know it's a tradition, it's a big tradition that's kept here, but it's appropriate because last week we were speaking regarding the matter of the feasts. God has
Mhm.
provided us seven wonderful feasts through Christ as the reality. And I think it's good that we spend a little bit of time to see just how important it is, right? It's very important for Americans to gather together, but even more important that we gather together to the appointed time that God has commanded us, especially in the practice of the holy and royal priesthood. And if we're preparing for the Lord's coming, right? Because when the Lord comes, he wants to gather together with us in person, right? And I'm pretty sure we'll be feasting with the Lord quite often. And so it's good that we spend a little bit of time to talk about the feast today.
But definitely. I hope everyone also enjoyed the chart last time, what we saw to see the
Hmm.
relation of the feasts and the offerings, because
Right.
it is, I think it's very crucial to see the meaning and to see the
Hmm.
point that before God requires his offerings from his people, he
Right.
provides them with a
Hmm.
good land that has multiple harvests a year. And
Yes.
this you can see in the feasts of the Lord. It really shows the provision of God. And
Right.
maybe some of the listeners are wondering, where does it speak about the feasts of the Lord in the Bible? Because
Mm.
actually, it's not so common, maybe, for Christians to
Right.
talk about this. Even
No.
though I hope you will see today, it is very crucial and very essential in God's plan. And I'm not exaggerating.
Right.
This is really
Hmm.
something the Lord Jesus was very, very um, careful about the feasts of the
Yeah.
Lord. We can
Hmm.
really prove that. But first,
Yeah.
the chapter where you can really read an excellent summary is Leviticus 23. I have to say,
Yes.
I just read it this week and I really enjoyed to read it because
Hmm.
everything in this chapter speaks about Christ and about what we need to do as his people in the new covenant. So
Right.
Leviticus 23, I want to encourage everyone to get into it, to read it. And just to prove, before we get further on with how to apply the feast of the Lord today,
Hmm.
the word feast in the Bible has not just to do with a celebration, but actually
Right.
it has to do with a fixed point of time. The
Hmm.
word feast has to do, in German, it is the same suffix, a prefix like fixed, right? It means fixed
Hmm.
time. And
Right.
really impressive is when you look into the first four feasts, they
Right.
determine the fixed time of the main steps of Christ's work on the earth. That is
Yes.
amazing. I mean, we all
Right.
know Christ was crucified, but when was he crucified? Did he just
Right.
choose on his own? Or did the Romans determine when it should happen? No,
Yeah.
actually, it was determined already in Leviticus 23 when Christ should die, because it is on the day of the Passover feast. And that's
Right.
amazing. The Lord kept to the day, He even kept to the hour when the feast
Hmm.
is taking place and when the lamb there is slaughtered. That's the time He died
Right.
on the cross. And then
Yeah.
when did He raise from the dead? He did not choose
Hmm.
His own day, but He
Right.
had to rise exactly on the day of the first feast of the first fruit. And that's
Right.
exactly what he did. So the feasts of the Lord, they are prophesying and describing already the main steps of Christ, of his work on this earth.
Right.
So we can
Yeah.
definitely see this is not a minor thing in the Bible. This is a
Mm.
major truth, and that's why it's definitely worth it and important to speak about it. Yeah.
Right. I'm glad we are speaking about it because, when I talk to Christians around my neighborhood and just in general, this matter of the feast, the Lord's
Mm-hmm.
table, or some would call it communion, it's not taken in a quite a serious way. I mean, when they actually do it, maybe they have some, reverence there. But I mean, it's oftentimes referred to as a tradition, and
Mm-hmm.
may not be done every week. It's done maybe once a month. I've heard, and you had mentioned to me once a year,
Yeah.
right? And it's not a very well understood meaning of the meeting, right? Why
Mm-hmm.
is there the Lord's communion? But as you said, it's amazing, right? When you look at all of the feasts, the first four feasts, it's the appointed time, and
Mm-hmm.
Christ is the reality of it. And he, when he was on this earth, fulfilled the first four feasts already.
Right.
The feast of the Passover, the feast of the unleavened bread, the feast of the first fruits, and also on the day of Pentecost, the feast of
Right.
Pentecost. Right, all four were fulfilled by the Lord, and this is very significant. So, how can we ignore it, or how can we
Mm-hmm.
brush it aside? I think it's very important, right? And this matter, the feast, since we mentioned the Lord's table, this is exactly what the Lord commanded his disciples to do, right? In Matthew chapter 26,
Right.
and this is many Christians refer it to as the Last Supper. Beginning in
Mm-hmm.
verse 26, and as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remissions of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." Right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is very important. The Lord instituted the Lord's table, right? It's not just the
Right.
Last Supper, it's the Lord's table. And later in First Corinthians, you hear, do this as often as you can, right? So how can we ignore this meeting, right? This is a very important meeting that the Lord himself instituted, right?
Absolutely. And what is amazing here in the verses
Mm-hmm.
before, the Lord said to his disciples, for example, or the disciples said to him, where in verse 17, where do you want us to
Right.
prepare for you to eat the Passover? So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that was not just a dinner, that was the
Right.
Passover feast. It was exactly the
Yeah.
time, verse 19,
Right.
or well, yeah, verse 19. He says, so the disciples did as Jesus had directed them as they prepared the Passover. And in 18, he
Mm-hmm.
says, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the
Mm-hmm.
Passover at your house with my disciples. And we
Right.
know from the book of Exodus how the Passover feast was celebrated when they moved out of Egypt. They had bread to eat, they had the lamb
Right.
to eat, they had bitter herbs to it. But then while they were eating this bread,
Mm-hmm.
then what happens? Then all of a sudden Jesus takes that bread and then he says to them when he breaks it, this is my
Mm-hmm.
body.
Right.
Oh, this is amazing. He does not
Right.
say, take, eat, this bread is unleavened, or this bread symbolizes my body. He says, this
Right.
is my body. And that
Mm-hmm.
really shows us this bread that the Jews had used and baked and eaten in the Passover feast for decades or centuries before
Right.
that evening came was only the shadow. It was not the real substance, the real bread that God wanted to give. But now here
Mm-hmm.
the Lord Jesus said, this is my body. That shows now the Lord's Supper, the Lord's table, it is absolutely now bringing in the reality of what the
Yes.
Jews had celebrated before as the shadow. Before it's
Right.
just a bread, but it's only the shadow, it's not the real. But now here comes the Lord and says, "This is my body. Now this is the real bread." So actually,
Yeah.
the Lord's table, because this
Mm-hmm.
is this is then what the Lord tells them, as you said. The Lord said to them, "Drink of this wine in remembrance of me." Right? And
Mm-hmm.
in Luke, he says it like this, and that
Mm-hmm.
shows this is so important to the Lord that we realize now the reality has come of all these feasts, and we need to keep
Right.
this at the
Yeah.
Lord's table. And I
Right.
personally didn't see that 10 years ago. 10 years ago was
Mm-hmm.
the first time I clearly saw that. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that might be new to a lot of us that whenever we went and had the Lord's table, or many call it communion, right? Did we really
Right.
think, wow, this is the reality of the Passover feast? I'm not sure.
Right.
But
Yep.
once we
Mhm.
see that, and we will get into that more, then we'll see, wow, this is a real big feast that we are celebrating here. Yeah.
Yeah. No, the same for me. It was, 10 years ago when we started to speak about the true worship from John
Right,
chapter 4,
exactly.
right? And we were got into the burden regarding the matter of the holy priesthood, right?
Yeah,
And for me, it really uplifted my view of what the Lord's table meeting was, right?
really, yeah.
Growing up, growing up, I think we both were very faithful to come every Sunday to
Yeah.
gather together for the Lord's table meeting. And I think during those days, we would sing hymns that may reflect on our experience during the week, which isn't bad. But we would just sing it, and then we would pray with those songs.
Right.
Um, and then we partake of the bread, and we know the Lord is the bread of life. So, okay, we
Yeah.
partook of the bread. We knew the wine as the cup of blessing, so we partook of the cup of blessings. But it was just the bread and the wine. And okay, maybe the spiritual blessings that we read in Ephesians, but it wasn't. And then when we got to the matter of the worship of the Father, I think at that point it was just a matter of singing a song to appreciate the Father, and that's about it. And so, was that wrong? I would say it wasn't wrong, but it was very, very minimal, right?
Right.
We lack tremendously the reality and the significance of what the Lord's table really meant. And with the opening of the priesthood 10 years ago, and to see what in all these feasts that Christ is as the reality, and now it's all encompassed in this feast meeting, the Lord's table meeting, there is much more richness when we gather together. And
Right.
it's not a tradition, it's not just a habit, but it is not only a celebration, but it's an encouragement for us to continue to partake and to eat of what God has provided for us. And as we get into the matter of the reality of all the feasts, to realize that this is what will get us to the goal to becoming first fruits, right?
Absolutely.
And so this is a very important. It is significant, right? And then now I can understand why the disciples when they were together with the Lord, it made such an impression that when on the day of Pentecost, right after the church in Jerusalem came together, we were talking earlier, the verses here in Acts chapter 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
They after they started to gather together to meet together, then what did they do? In verse 42, and they continue steadfastly in the apostles' teachings and fellowship, in the breaking of bread and in prayers, right? And then they went to verse 4. If you go to verse 46, so continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they ate
Mm-hmm.
their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all people, right? So this matter of the Lord's table was even I think at this point they continue to break bread daily, right? And
Right.
so this is such an impression. And do we have such an appreciation and impression regarding the Lord's table meeting,
Yeah.
right? And
I mean,
so,
I don't know how often everyone who listens to this actually really partakes in it. We
hmm
personally do it every week, on
right.
the first day of the week, because it's written
Yeah,
in Acts 20, verse 7.
right.
Right? It's a
Yeah.
very clear reference
hmm
um, about the
The
point of
first
time,
day of the week.
the first
Yes.
day of the week, which for us is then the Sunday.
Yeah.
And this is really crucial that we should really understand why did the
hmm
Lord in, introduce his table at a
hmm
Passover feast. I mean, he could have chosen any other day. He could have chosen another point of time, right? For us,
Yeah.
we would think, oh, maybe it was just because that was the time they were all together for dinner. No, it was
hmm
exactly on the same day like the Passover feast, because he wants to show the disciples now the fulfillment has come. This is the reality. The feast the
Right.
Lord instituted on
hmm
that night, the Lord's table, is truly the reality of the Passover. And that's why
Right.
he did it at the same point of time. And no
hmm
disciple after that evening returned to celebrate it the old way, because now the reality had come.
Yeah.
And this is
Exactly.
so big. I mean, when the Jews celebrate their Passover feast, they all remember the exodus out of Egypt, the freedom, the liberation, the delivery from slavery, and the
hmm
escape from judgment and the angel of wrath. So
Right. Yeah.
this is a feast. I'm sure the generation who had really experienced that one night in Egypt, they were celebrating it. I mean, they
Right.
were
Yeah.
they were remembering it very vividly and with
hmm
appreciation. They were not doing this as a routine because
Right.
they used
Right.
to live in slavery. Now they lived in freedom. They
Yeah.
used to really in that night hear the screams and shouts of the Egyptians, and they saw
hmm
their firstborn son survive because of the blood on the doorposts. It was
Yeah.
very vivid to them. And now the Lord says, okay, even what they experienced so big before their eyes, now here the Lord's table is introduced by him at the same point of time, and he's showing like that. Now this is the real table of the Lord. Now you
hmm
have really been set free, not just from
Right.
Egyptians, but from Satan, not just from a slave work, but from sin that is the real slave master, right? And, and
Exactly.
and this is the Lord's table is big in the Bible.
hmm
It's really big. And I
Yes.
mean, you mention it in Acts 2. In the
Right.
summary of what a church really should do, the church of the Lord,
hmm
they're mentioning
Yep.
four kinds of meetings, right? The apostles' teaching and fellowship. Was that two? Then the
Right.
breaking of bread and prayers. So yeah,
Right.
today everyone likes teaching, but hey, that
hmm
is actually not the feast of the Lord. That is not the
Yep.
meeting even the Lord introduced as a must. But the Lord's
Right.
table, where we have this reality of those feasts,
Yeah.
we should
Right.
all really come and see what we are doing there. This is so crucial that we
Yeah.
see it. Yeah,
Right. Right. And, as you're speaking about the impact of the impression that the Jews must have had regarding the Passover, you remind me again in First Corinthians chapter 5.
exactly. Yeah,
When you get to verse 7, it says, "For indeed Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us."
yeah,
Right? So that confirms that Christ is the reality of the feast of the Passover, right? I mean, do we have that same kind of impression when we gather together? And it's not just, that we were delivered from the slave master, not just that, the Passover during the death angel went over and then we were spared. What was the goal of the Passover feast? I know we'll talk about this probably in the next episode, but we have to remember the goal of the Passover was to free them from the bondage of Egypt, not just to be set free, but to
Right.
go into the good, to get into the promised land, but not just to enjoy the fat of the land there, but that they would become a kingdom of priests. They would
Yeah.
become the rulers, right? And this is really God's desire, is that he would have his true worship there, right? For them, their worship was in Jerusalem, and eventually Jerusalem will be at the center of the whole world. But for us today, this is our way of preparing, right? We are not just redeemed, we're not just saved, our sin is not just forgiven so that we're spared from God's eternal judgment. But God's desire is to set us free so that we can grow and ultimately become first fruits, to
Yeah.
rule and reign together with him in his coming kingdom age. That's a marvelous view of the Passover. But
Yes.
yes, you're right. This is very significant, right? And if you go on to verse 8, you'll also see that he is the unleavened. Sorry, in verse 7, it says, since you truly are unleavened, right? So the matter of the feast of the unleavened bread is there as well, right? So
Right.
Christ, here in just this one verse, you can see that Christ is the reality of the feast of the Passover. And when you talk about Christ as the reality of the feast of the unleavened bread, at the end of verse 8, it says, but the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth, right? So Christ is the reality of all of
Yeah.
these feasts that you referenced in Leviticus chapter 23. And so, as I said, in the coming episodes, we will get into this, and maybe you'll want to get into it already, because I think by now, if you have this mindset that we've been speaking about, then when you read through Leviticus 23, ask the Lord, tell the Lord, Lord, show me, reveal to me that you are the reality of all these feasts as I read Leviticus 23. Right? This is a very, I would say, very significant priority meeting that we always should make to come in our week.
Definitely.
Right? I know
Definitely.
growing up, my of all the meetings my parents told me growing up, don't miss the Lord's table meeting. And so I remembered that. But now with all of what the Lord has shown us in these last 10 years as the reality of Christ, of the reality of all these feasts, I can understand why this is the most important meeting of the week, right? And one more verse I'm reminded of here is in Hebrews chapter 12, verse
Mm-hmm.
22 and verse 23. What is our attitude when we gather together? In verse 22 should give us a good understanding, and we should have this consciousness when we gather together for the Lord's table meeting. But when you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an
Mm-hmm.
innumerable company of angels, to the festal gathering, right? In the New
Mm-hmm.
King James, it says the General Assembly. Well, what does the
Yeah.
General Assembly really mean? But when you look into the little footnote, it actually says it should be
Exactly.
called the festal gathering, the church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God, the judge of all, to the spirit of just men made perfect, right? So this should be our attitude when we come together, to gather together as the church. We're not just gathering to have some kind of a, tradition or some kind of a meeting, but this is a festal gathering. It's a time for
Absolutely.
all of us, brothers and sisters who are priests in the priesthood, to gather together at the appointed time, at his appointed location for the feast, to celebrate, not just to celebrate, but to partake of all of the riches of Christ as the feast, the reality of the
Right.
feast. So, yeah, may the Lord open our eyes to see this.
I mean, this is a really wonderful verse here, Hebrews 12:23.
Mhm.
He says, "We
Yeah,
have come. We have come." It's not the
yeah,
future, it's past tense, right? You have come.
right.
And then he says to
Hmm.
the festal gathering. Um,
Yes,
yeah, every feast, there has to be food. You
right.
cannot have a feast without food. I mean, you're gonna have Thanksgiving tonight. Have you ever seen
Yeah.
Thanksgiving without food?
No.
No, no way. That's the richest food of the whole year. I've been a few
Yeah.
times to a Thanksgiving in the US, and I mean,
Yeah.
there's food on the table that would feed 5 times as many people as usually come, right?
Right.
So there's food, and in which meeting that we have, there's food. Like, I mean, real
Mm-hmm.
physical food. The only meeting where we really have food to see
Mm-hmm.
is the Lord's table, right? And
Yes.
why is it? Why is it the Lord has really commanded it like that, right? First Corinthians 11, it
Mm-hmm.
says it very strongly. It says, I receive from the Lord in verse 23 that which I also delivered to you. So
Right.
it is really a command by the Lord. I mentioned this
Mm-hmm.
only shortly before, Luke 22. The Lord really said very clearly, um, in verse 19, do this in
Mm-hmm.
remembrance of me. Luke 22,
Yeah.
19. Do this. This is a command. So
Mm-hmm.
by not coming to the Lord's table,
Right.
it's not a small thing. Because the
Yeah.
Lord said, do this in remembrance of me. You
Right.
might you might miss a meeting or some preaching.
Right.
Uh, it's not as serious as missing the Lord's table. Because the
Mm-hmm.
Lord really wants us to come together and hold the
Yeah.
feast with Him.
Right.
He is with us when we do it, not physically, but in the spirit. And
Yeah.
and this is really, really precious that we have a festal gathering. And when we come together to the Lord's table, it is really not about a tradition, as we mentioned. It is
Right.
the physical manifestation that the reality has come of all the feasts of
Yeah.
the Lord. It is really a
Right.
manifestation. When the Lord introduced it on the Passover night, He made it
Mm-hmm.
clear this is a time now. You've celebrated this in reality. And
Yeah.
this is, I mean, how can you celebrate the Lord's table in reality? Only because you're doing bread and wine? No, that's not
No.
enough. The
Right.
reality is always in the spirit. That means you really
Yes.
have to turn. You have to turn
Right.
your mind, you have to turn your heart to the Lord.
Yeah.
You have to really turn from your flesh, from yourself to the spirit. And when you
Right.
are really turning to the spirit and you are in the spirit participating, that means in
Mm-hmm.
unity with the Lord, not just
Yeah.
sitting there as a believer. Then when you eat
Right.
the bread, you can truly eat the Lord Himself and partake of Him. And that
Yes.
makes the feast, the Lord's table, real. That makes it
Right.
powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's something, it's good to get into those verses again, but really to see the Lord wants to bring us still together in the New Testament as
Mm-hmm.
appointed
Yeah.
times. And when is that
Right.
appointed time? It is His table. He wants to bring us
Yes.
together. You cannot celebrate the table of the Lord by yourself in your house. I mean, you can
No.
celebrate in your house, but you need the others, the saints, to come,
Yeah.
right? You need to,
Right.
like they did it from house to house, but you have to come together, and you have to come together
Right.
in the spirit. And
Right.
this is what it means today to keep the feast, to really
Yeah.
keep the Lord's table in reality, not as a tradition. That will not help. No,
Right. And
right.
as you mentioned, it's a feast, right? Tonight, Sharon is not providing all the food. All the relatives, the family, and the brothers and sisters are coming. Everyone is coming with a prepared dish. And you're right,
Hmm.
we're going to have more food than what we know what to do with, and we'll always have to give leftovers afterwards. But this then definitely applies for the Lord's table meeting. We come in the spirit, but then also have we prepared the feast, right? Do we have
Yeah,
a dish, right? And this is why, the Lord's table meeting, when we gather together for the feast and for the worship of the Father, when all the saints come with their hands filled with Christ, it is a real rich meeting.
yeah,
Not only is the Father satisfied, but we are also satisfied. And it
definitely.
also encourages even more in the new week to labor and to experience Christ in our daily life. right? So
Yeah,
it really done that cycle, that feast cycle, feast, the offerings and the feast chart that we showed last week really makes sense, right? And
absolutely.
in the end, again, we just have to remind one another, we remind our listeners, this is God's wisdom in preparing us to grow, to mature early, to become the first fruits, right? The Lord is really coming soon, right? We may be feasting today for Thanksgiving, but we should really be looking forward to meeting the Lord in person, right? It says this a few times in the scripture. He wants to dine with us physically in person in his coming kingdom age. So, with that, we encourage everyone to get into it, get into the reality and the practice of keeping the feast. You're already experiencing Christ as the offerings, but now we need to also experience Christ as the feast and to practically to come together in Zion at the festal gathering. So
Right.
with Christian, I know we're both, you and I, we got more to do to prepare for the feast, or the Thanksgiving feast. So we'll have to stop the podcast at this point. But it's good to fellowship with you. Enjoy the Thanksgiving feast there in Germany as we will. But then more importantly, may we enjoy Christ as the
This
reality
is
in
the
all the
real
feasts.
feast. There
Exactly.
it should really be satisfying for God and for man. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. May
So,
we all really see that point, how precious the Lord's table is, and then come
right.
participate in reality. That will definitely change our view for this wonderful
Exactly.
gathering. Yeah.
Right. All right.
Yes.
So
Well,
until next week.
see you
Yeah.
next week, huh?
All right. Have a good feast.
Thank you. Same to you, huh? Okay.
All right.
Bye.